Good afternoon. This is Janet Marchabrota with Alliance for Cell Therapy Now. And we're here to talk with two important people from Capitol Hill. Actually, for those of you who are on this morning and even over the noon hour, there has been a lot of discussion about a full range of policy issues. And I'll tell you, while some of the issues, additional technical assistance to some extent, there's some issues that can be addressed within the federal agency. But the vast majority of the policy issues that we've discussed this morning and over the noon hour really require action from Congress. And it turns out, for our two speakers today, that many of the issues raised so far today actually fall under the jurisdiction of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, what most people call HELP, the Senate Health Committee. And so we're so delighted to have with us this afternoon two individuals who work for those committees, for that committee, and actually the leadership of that committee. We've got Garrett DeVenney. He works in the office of Senator Patty Murray, Democratic senator from the state of Washington. And Senator Murray is the ranking member or the lead Democrat in the Senate Health Committee. And then we also pleased to have Andrew Vogt, or Andy Vogt, and he is in the office of Senator Lamar Alexander, Republican from Tennessee, who is the chairman of the Senate Health Committee. And together, those two offices and those two leaders have really pushed forward really amazing legislation, whether from education, and for all of us here, the 21st Century Cures Act was really big. And these two offices, their senators, the staff who are with us today, played a really big role in all of that. So we're really glad to have the two of you. Welcome. We're just going to get right into it. And I know we're going to spend a little bit of time on discussion, no slides, discussion amongst us about some of the issues that I think a number of the participants care about. And I thought maybe, and then we'll open it up. We're going to leave some time for discussion. So make sure you put your questions in your online chat on the bottom right of your screen. So I thought maybe we'd start with an overview. And Andy, if I could start with you, what are some of the key priorities of your office right now, and actually the Senate Health Committee?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with that. I think, the committee has a lot of priorities. I think this week we had one or two hearings even on education issues. So I'll focus on the health side because that's what I know better. Obviously, we're focused on the COVID-19 pandemic, as you might expect, but there are a couple of other things as well that are worth mentioning. So our committee has 5 programs in our jurisdiction that get mandatory funding. All of them are very important. They're the Community Health Center program, National Health Service Corps, Teaching Health Center GME program, Special Diabetes program, and Special Diabetes program for Indians. Their mandatory funding runs out November 30th. And so we're working on getting a longer term extension of that. Senator Alexander and Senator Murray have a bill that would do that, 5 years of funding. And then we're also working on a few programs that receive discretionary funding, but have authorizations that expire on September 30th. And, kind of remains to be seen what happens with those. Obviously, like I said, COVID-19 is definitely dominating a lot of the conversations, but Garrett and I work on a lot of other issues, HRSA and NIH, et cetera, that are not necessarily related to COVID-19. And so we're continuing to work on those as everything else happens.
Thank you. And Garrett, can you share your insights? What are your views on the priorities of the committee as well as the priorities of the senator, your office?
Yeah, like Andy said, I totally echo everything he said on the primary care programs. Mm-hmm. I think Senator Murray is still trying to get the lower healthcare costs across the finish line, which includes long-term extension of those primary care programs. I'm sure folks know that package includes a fix for the surprise billing issue. It also includes a lot of other programs, grant programs, such as expanding Project Echo, which basically connects specialists with providers in rural areas to democratize knowledge and really promote specialty care in underserved areas. There's also a couple provisions in there related to vaccines generally and promoting confidence in vaccines, which we know is becoming increasingly important as we prepare for an eventual safe and effective COVID-19 vaccine. I think specifically in the HRSA NIH portfolios, we're very focused on not only supporting the current workforce, but expanding that workforce to not only be able to better respond to the pandemic, but better prepare for the next one as well. Because we know those providers on the front line have been under-resourced for years now. So those are a couple of the priorities that we're focused on. And obviously we have a ton of COVID specific priorities as well.
Yeah, I know. Just a lot going on for all of us. And we appreciate all of your leadership in that area. Could we talk a little bit about the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and how it's impacted other non-COVID related priorities, particularly around biomedical innovation or research priorities? I know NIH is part of your jurisdiction. Maybe Andy, start with you.
Sure. I think broadly speaking, the senator is focused on preparing for the next pandemic. He released a white paper a couple months ago, and from that, a few specific priorities have emerged. First, he's focused on telemedicine. Obviously, it's here and it works. So I think he would like to codify some of the temporary changes that have been made, especially around eliminating geographic and originating site restrictions, increasing the type of services that can be provided, and just in general, giving the Secretary of HHS more flexibility related to telehealth. He's also interested, Garrett alluded to vaccines, he's interested in making sure that we can increase onshore manufacturing of vaccines, improve state stockpiles, and then make sure that there's sustained funding for public health. I think all of those things will help, make sure that we're better prepared the next time a pandemic hits. And then as far as the pandemic impacting other non-COVID priorities, I think more than anything, the pandemic has created new challenges, and NIH is a great example. For a long time, we've been worried about young investigators and, them choosing other careers or going overseas because the funding might not be there for them. And I think to the credit of Senator Murray and Senator Blunt and the House appropriators as well, funding for NIH has increased significantly over the last 5-6 years. And that's maybe a little bit less of a concern, but I think now there's a real worry again that they are going to be disproportionately impacted. And then there's a concern that, research has been paused or disrupted, and there's a need for more funding to sort of mitigate that impact. And so that's something that Chairman Alexander has been supportive of as well.
Great. Garrett, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so in terms of COVID-19 specific priorities, Senator Murray, she also laid out a white paper, I think either a month or 2 months ago at this point. It's hard to keep track of time these days, on the need for the administration to develop a national comprehensive vaccines plan, all the way from research and development, review, manufacturing, distribution, allocation, and administration. So all along the pipeline of vaccine development, Senator Murray feels very strongly that the administration needs to lay out that plan as soon as possible. We saw that the administration released a vaccine distribution plan this morning. We are still combing our way through that. I think from Senator Murray's perspective, this would have been helpful, a couple months ago, at least. I think we still need to see specific interest and attention allotted to addressing racial and ethnic disparities, as well as health disparities more broadly, whether that be through increasing enrollment in ongoing clinical trials for communities of color and people of color, as well as making sure that once we have a safe and effective COVID-19 vaccine, it's actually getting to those populations. And we know there's going to be several challenges associated with a COVID-19 vaccine. Most of the candidates are 2-dose, that will require between 21 and 28 days in between the 2 doses. There are concerns for rural areas in terms of cold chain storage technologies and the ability to keep the vaccine at a certain temperature. So we really need to have this all laid out well in advance, for whenever FDA deems a COVID-19 vaccine safe for use. I think some of the other priorities, obviously, Senator Murray's been a leader on testing. She helped to secure the $25 billion testing fund in the Paycheck Protection Program and Healthcare Enhancement Act. We would like to see additional investment in testing to expand it even more, especially as our workplaces and schools are reopening. And then lastly, to Andy's point on impacts on biomedical research, I think we share the concern on the impact of young researchers. And I think in addition to securing funding for lost productivity due to labs and researchers having to stop their work, I think we would be interested in extending some of the flexibilities for those dollars for these researchers to use to cover expenses they may not normally be able to use those expenses for. So we've seen the Office of Management and Budget allow for those flexibilities in terms of, having those dollars go towards salary, benefits, other streams that these dollars were not intended for. But during COVID, it's especially dire. So I think in terms of the impacts of biomedical research, you can't turn it off and on. So we need to jumpstart that research back up with additional dollars and allow for flexibility as they get rolling.
If I could, I'd like to switch gears just a little bit. Both of your bosses, Chairman Alexander and Ranking Member Murray, were the critical leaders in the 21st, some of the critical leaders in advancing the 21st Century Cures Act, which had broad support amongst everyone, I would say, both sides of the aisle across the public and private sectors, and have really, played a role in advancing biomedical innovation. And one of the provisions, there were a couple provisions in the act related to regenerative medicine and cell therapies, which, a number of the hundreds of folks who are on the line, are really interested in or working in, whether they're researchers or industry manufacturers or patients. And I wonder if you might share, maybe start with you, Andy, and I know you know a lot about this topic. I wonder if you might be able to share some of the work that your office is doing related to regenerative medicine and cell therapies.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think, as the 21st Century Cures Act was being worked on, I wasn't on the committee at the time, but, was involved in some of those discussions. And so it's interesting for me now. I don't actually have the FDA in my portfolio. And so, I haven't been able to follow as closely some of those provisions, the RMAT pipeline, and there was a provision on standards for regenerative medicine. So, I'd be interested in feedback in terms of how those are going. But one of the things that we're working on now is a reauthorization of the C.W. Bill Young cell transplantation program and the National Cord Blood Inventory. Both, those programs, authorization expires on September 30th. That was one of the ones that I was alluding to above. And Senator Byrd, Senator Reed in the Senate have been working on a reauthorization of that. And so from what it sounds like, they're close to introducing a bill. It could be as soon as this week or maybe even next week. And then from there, we're very interested in moving it forward. Garrett and I have talked with those offices and would like to move quickly on it. So that's the main thing in that space. But certainly would welcome feedback on the provisions from Cures.
Yeah, and I can just add to that on the CW Bill Young Cell Transplantation Program and National Cord Blood Inventory. The House Energy and Commerce Committee marked up their version of the bill last week. It passed out of the committee on a unanimous vote, bipartisan. So I know that our House colleagues have also been working to address this issue. So really hoping that we're going to be able to address the September 30th cliff before the programs lapse. But that's a big priority in the short term.
That's great to hear. I know, you should know, a number of our participants online care very, very much about that act and the CW Bill Young program. We're one of our partners is Alliance for Cell Therapy Now, Regenerative Medicine Foundation, and the Cord Blood Association are partners with this conference. And so thank you. Thanks so much for the update. If I could switch back to NIH, which I know is part of Senate Help. So it turns out, and there has been a lot of activity in this area. It's been very exciting. There are thousands and thousands now of clinical trials for any condition involving regenerative medicine or cell therapies. The broad, I think Robin is going to talk later today. She counted 37,000. And if you start to break it down on the different types of cells, the last we checked, more than 1,200 clinical trials on something called MSCs. And we had a great panel this morning with University of Miami, Mayo, and Duke University around the use of MSCs for COVID-19. And Mayo talked a little bit about their research there. We did an analysis, again, haven't published it yet, but about more than 80 clinical trials in the world. This is the US and abroad of the use of cell therapies for COVID-19. And, I won't get into most of it relates to lung injury, acute respiratory distress syndrome, and how these therapies actually support and address a lot of the issues for these patients. And so seeing some early results, they're starting to be published. And the other thing that we're seeing is while many of these clinical trials have moved forward, FDA approved, and Peter Marks talked about that. When you look at the portfolios of the NIH or BARDA or some of the other federal agencies, there is very little funding if you actually look at it. So little, I would say less than 1% of, depending on your denominator, of funding directed towards regenerative medicine and cell therapies. And while the industry, can self-fund those trials, these academic centers are having a tough time. And I wonder, are there steps that we can take or that others can take in the Senate to sort of address this issue? And what advice might you have for us on how to, continue to advance that priority?
I can jump in first. I think this is always a tough question. People come to us and they say, this condition is underfunded relative to the burden of the disease, and we'd like more funding for it. And it's tough because Congress, I think, generally appropriates money to NIH and specific amounts for the institutes at NIH, but we try to remember that we're not the experts, and the experts are at NIH, not in Congress. Dr. Collins, the director of NIH, has talked about how their funding decisions are made for a variety of reasons, but especially based on scientific opportunity and then the quality of the application of the proposal. And since we don't really see those, I think it's hard for us to say we're unhappy because this type of research is only getting a certain amount compared to another type. And I think one question I have for you is just in terms of quantifying how much is being done. NIH lists out their categorical spending, and so based on that, it might look like not very much is going towards cell therapies or this type of research, because if it's using cell therapy for diabetes, it might show up as diabetes. But if you actually search for like cell therapies, the way you talked about, you might get 30,000 results. So I think the question is sort of, how well can we track where the money is going, and from there, does the agency need to sort of give some additional consideration to it? But it's hard from Congress to specify in legislation how much should be going to a specific type of research.
Understood.
Yeah, and just to build off that, I was actually looking this up this morning. I think in the FY20 appropriations bill, there was $8 million specifically set aside for regenerative medicine. But to Andy's point, the other institutes and centers may be utilizing regenerative medicine in clinical trials, investigating a number of diseases. And I think there was in the section on cerebral palsy, specifically in the FY20 bill, there was some report language from our appropriations colleagues that encouraged NIH to explore funding opportunities in regenerative medicine for cerebral palsy. So, obviously funding is always going to be a challenge when everyone is trying to take a bite out of the same apple. However, I do think it is worthwhile trying to build on existing report language from previous appropriations bills. And, if there are promising findings from work done in the regenerative medicine space for a number of conditions, trying to have appropriations insert that specific call out, similar to the cerebral palsy, or, encouraging NIH to collaborate more with FDA and HRSA and other agencies to promote regenerative medicine and clinical trials that utilize these technologies. So I think, there's kind of two avenues you can pursue there.
And I think that's a good point about report language too. I was just going to jump in to say, I think NIH, there was some money in the 21st Century Cures Act for regenerative medicine. And I think NIH tried to use that to look at ways to support research that could sort of transform the field or move it forward in a way that's not just, looking at one clinical trial or for one condition. And so things like that would be helpful just to know, like, what is coming from that research and how can we build on it in report language or, with legislative activity to, really support the field.
One of the things, as you two probably know, for the first time we had, and I think Chairman Alexander was actually a big supporter of this, in the 21st Century Cures Act, they called for about $30 million in funding for regenerative medicine research. And that was the first time ever it was called out. So we're grateful for Chairman Alexander and Senator Murray's leadership on that, as well as folks on the House side. But we know it expires, I guess, at the end of this month, and it's not clear. I know, wrong committee, but what we're going to do with spending this year is unclear. I guess, so we're hopeful that there can be some, renewal of that funding as you all move forward, or as the Appropriations Committee and the House and Senate move forward. And probably some expansion when you look at 30 million as a percentage of the total spend at NIH. But Garrett, so you talked about appropriations, and one thing, we were really glad to see in the language last year for fiscal year 20, and actually in the House language for fiscal year 21, was encouraging, as you said, in the report language, for the FDA to work closely with the NIH on outcomes, measurement of outcomes, or an outcomes database. So we were really excited about that, because that has been a key focus of our organization, advancing that over the last couple of years, but no funding and not a lot of progress there. And so perhaps that's something for next year. But related, so I'm going to related to that, and I'm looking at our questions, I encourage folks, make sure you go to your Slido, because we're going to approach questions here in a few minutes and give us, we're going to go to audience Q&A. So put your questions in. Okay, so going from appropriations, the outcomes database, what's exciting, what works, and this relates to something that the 3 former FDA commissioners, Mark McClellan, Rob Califf, and Andy von Eschenbach, and Peter Marks, our FDA CBER director, talked a lot about, was this need for collaboration. I think, I think they probably spent half the time, talking about how, COVID has brought people together, and that we, one of the things that we need to do as an industry, as a field, is to come together, and particularly the academic and research institutions, to sort of build on the evidence, whether it's through a network. And I'll just, a plug for some, all the academic institutions and industry and folks. We actually launched in March of this year a really big group, and we meet every Tuesday, of academic and research institutions and industry and patient and philanthropy organizations who've come together. When we talked to Peter Marks earlier this year, he said, you need, a large scale, multi-center, randomized clinical trial. And this was pre-COVID, and then COVID came along, and a number of academic institutions and health systems came together. And they actually got FDA approval of an IND for a clinical trial. And part of that was the beginnings, I'm getting to my point, the beginnings of, we recognize not everyone can be involved in the clinical trial, right? And so how can we work together? And we started to, with our advisory board and Mark Overhage, launch this collaborative evidence development activity. It's sort of along the lines of what's in the report language and appropriations, recognizing that maybe this could be a model for government moving forward on this. And they're actually collecting data. We're not just doing it in the US, but also internationally, collecting data from all the MSCs. MSCs are a type of cell therapy for COVID-19. So I'm sort of linking different things. In your jurisdiction, Peter Marks and Rob and Mark and Andy talking about the need for collaboration, and thinking about your committee. We think that's right, and we're starting to model it, but maybe we need something more institutionalized. So how could that happen? Is that something that Congress can help advance, or does it need to happen organically? So collaboration around evidence, or clinical trial network, or evidence development. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that, and I'll use an example from COVID to kind of illustrate my example. So for folks that aren't aware, the NIH, I believe it was a few months ago, launched the COVID-19 Prevention Network, which is a network of four different research centers that are collaborating and creating one unified clinical trials network for COVID-19 clinical trials related to vaccines and therapeutics. And the reason, Senator Murray is very interested in this CoVPN because Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle is one of the 4 collaborating centers. And, this is something that NIH decided to do on its own. There was no congressional directive to do so. However, I do think there is a role for Congress to play in terms of either encouraging more networks such as this. I think in a post-COVID world, we're going to learn a lot from this pandemic. I mean, we already are learning a lot, but I think we're going to be able to use these examples of how partners that traditionally have not worked together, that combine forces and their expertise to really achieve a goal here, how that can be translated in other spaces. So And I know that NIH has worked on a couple other similar projects, but I think not to this scale. So I do think that, going forward, NIH will probably focus more on these networks. I wouldn't be surprised. But it is something that, as we look towards regenerative medicine, and Janet, as you mentioned, all these various clinical trials, I think a unified national network or global network we're going to have to go there.
And I think to jump in, you might have been alluding to this when you mentioned the other work that NIH has done, but I think they've got an Accelerating Medicines partnership for Alzheimer's, and then I saw yesterday they announced one for schizophrenia, and these bring together NIH, FDA, the Foundation for NIH, industry and nonprofit groups, I assume academic medical centers. And, I don't know how exactly they choose who participates in that, but I think that would be something to look at as a potential way to try to foster that collaboration.
I know, so something that Joanne Kurtzberg, she's the president of the Cord Blood Association, one of our collaborating partners, but she talks about, because we're focused on regenerative medicine and cell therapies, but across multiple conditions, but the way that NIH is set up is around conditions. So the networks some of the networks that you described are condition specific, makes me think, how do we tackle that? You know what I mean? Therapy specific versus condition specific. But so let's see, how's our time? We're about where we need to go to the audience questions. So some of these are a little bit, so one of our speakers this morning, I don't know if you've met Maria Milan, but she's the CEO of the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. And there's a small set, just this is background for the question, in case you're not familiar. It's a state-funded entity. They're actually on the ballot again. Billions of dollars that the state of California, the taxpayers, have put into this field, regenerative medicine and cell therapy, and really amazing progress. They have, funded a lot of research. They funded both industry and academia. They've funded collaboration. What's really helpful is the other thing that she does is she helps with commercialization. Like, how do you cross that bridge? Okay, you've got an academic study, but now you want to get these therapies to patients. So a lot of work there. And then she engages patients amongst a whole host of, I'm not doing this justice, but several billion dollars. And the question here is, number one, why haven't more states adopted the California CIRM model? I don't know, from a federal panel perspective, I'm not sure whether you'd want to say anything, but could we see a future? Have we ever seen a situation, a large scale program? I'm trying to think of examples like that, like they're doing in California. Do you ever see that happening at the federal level? So big program, cuts across research, commercialization, engagement around these therapies.
I can touch on the first piece of that question while I think about the second piece. I haven't heard of similar models being used in other states, and I think that's probably a function of the strain on state budgets. And I think, unfortunately, again, not to keep bringing up COVID, but I think in the age of COVID, state and local budgets are even more strained than they have been. So I think it will be, unless there are additional funds provided by Congress for states and localities, I think it's going to be very challenging for state governments to contribute specific set aside dollars for initiatives like that. But that's obviously a broad assumption on my part.
Yeah, and it's hard to think of sort of a broad cross-cutting initiative like that. I think NIH has focused a bit on some like big data initiatives and things like that that have have impacted all of their institutes. but I have to really think about if there's other precedent for like a large scale initiative like that. It's a good question, though.
Yeah. So another question here. So we've talked, and I'm going to provide some context around it. So we've talked a lot, both this morning, the noon hour, and our discussion today, about the need to focus more on regenerative and cell therapies, whether it's through clinical trials or even we're going to hear a panel right after, hour after this on workforce development. A lot of the industry manufacturers, it's hard to hire people or train students to move into the field. Training of clinicians once these therapies hit the market. And then another thing, particularly as we've seen some emerging very promising results for MSCs for COVID-19, sort of how do you scale manufacturing? And I know BARDA has played a big role in helping some of the industry or the drug companies or the vaccine manufacturers, and how do we scale quickly to get treatments to patients? So they're saying, like, how do we get this on the front burner? Any advice for us? It's hard to cut through the noise, right? You've got people coming into your office every day, all day, with, asking, how do we cut through the noise? Any advice for us to be good advocates, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think the most helpful thing is just having sort of actionable issues that we can work on. And so I think the workforce example is a good one my office had a conversation with NIH recently about this, to talk about what they're doing in the space generally. And it was an issue that they brought up, but it's not necessarily one that we've heard a lot from really anybody about. And so I think the first step is just obviously making sure it's on our radar, but the second would be, proposing a specific solution, because, sometimes it's hard to sort of get that idea from scratch. Garrett and I can do it, but, it takes a while, and you really have to be, thoughtful about how you create that. And it's much easier for someone to bring an idea to us, then we can sort of facilitate a process we can go to HHS for TA. We can, talk with industry experts. We can talk with academic leaders. We can talk with, all kinds of people. And then, we have our own thoughts based on our own experience of, what might work well. And so from there, it's easier for us to sort of take the idea and translate it. And so I think that would be really helpful, just to, obviously make us aware, but then to provide us with specific things that we can take action on. Because there are, like you said, there are a lot of priorities that we have. And so it's just a matter of, for us, making sure that if we're going to start a project, that there's a clear path for, what the intention is that we're trying, what we're trying to solve, and how we can get it done.
And just to build on what Andy just said, he definitely alluded to this, but I think, even if it's not necessarily working directly with HELP Committee, working with other members of Congress to introduce legislation that includes priorities that you all are pushing for. I think it makes it a lot easier once staff members and also members have an actual bill number out there, either an HR bill or a Senate bill out there that you can direct all your advocacy efforts on. So I think, you talk a lot about 21st Century Cures Act, like having another bill out there, another package out there that includes priorities that you all want. I think that would help to unify the messaging and advocacy strategy. And then one more thing I'd add is, not that everything has to have a COVID lens to it, but I think it may be worthwhile drawing the connection between cell therapies and regenerative medicine and COVID-19, and how this type of technology and therapy can help us better respond to the pandemic and treat individuals who may have been affected. I think in terms of discussions with appropriators, that might be especially worthwhile and beneficial, because I think a lot of folks are, we don't have unlimited resources, unfortunately. So we do have to, have to limit where we spend our dollars. And I think drawing the connection, at least within the next couple of years, to COVID may be helpful.
And we've got emerging data. I mean, they're starting, I mentioned the 80 clinical trials, cell therapies and COVID with, we're seeing some early results from expanded access, and even randomized trials are starting to get published. So it's exciting. I think I have to think, we track it weekly. I think there are maybe up to 15 now. And so we could definitely, as a community, all of us come together around that. I think there's great promise. So here's a good. So do you expect another Cures bill in the next Congress? I know Representative Upton has talked about it. Will this happen?
I think it's hard to say. I mean, I don't. Senator Alexander is retiring, and so that's going to be a big change in terms of leadership of the committee. And then, I'm biased, but I just think that he has a big voice when it comes to healthcare policy. And so, obviously, Senator Murray will still be there, but there'll be a new Republican leader on the committee. And it just kind of remains to be seen what priorities they have, and what priorities Senator Murray has. So I just think it's too early to say, but. I think with Cures, there was sort of a build up to that point. There was, the House took action. On the Senate side, there was a white paper that was out, the Innovations for a Healthier America. And so I think that was a long process. It took like 3 years. And I don't know that I've seen sort of that level of coalescing around ideas, that we had at the same time when Cures was ongoing.
Well, the questions are starting to come in. So here's another one. So I know we're not quite sure when we're going to get a vaccine. Some Americans won't get a vaccine. A number of Americans, they're primarily those that don't make it, who have COVID. It's lung injury, it's acute respiratory distress syndrome, and related conditions. That's the short answer. And so we're going to need therapies to address that. And something that we saw, I think back in June, BARDA actually suspended that section of their, the funding for the billions of dollars that came out of the COVID supplemental for BARDA. And we agree, and I think everybody concurs that the focus should be on vaccines, but we were hopeful. We don't think we should turn off the spigot for therapies or therapeutics yet. And there's been some written about this. And actually, I think Senator Murray talked a little bit about it in the hearing with BARDA. Any thoughts on that? Should BARDA be spending more on therapeutics, or at least some on, I guess, at least some on therapeutics? Any thoughts there, or have you looked at that issue?
Yeah, I can comment on that, but definitely would defer to my colleagues who handle BARDA issues specifically. But yeah, I agree. Like in Senator Murray's vaccines white paper, we make mention of therapeutics as well. I think you're right, and a lot of the focus has been on vaccines, but I definitely think there should be parallel R&D being done on therapeutics as well. I think we need to be thinking about prevention here, so masks, eventual vaccines, but then also the tertiary care and secondary care in terms of the therapeutics. So I would agree with you on that both are necessary.
Andy?
Yeah, I think so too. I think I also would defer to my colleagues who handle BARDA. But I think, there should be a focus on tests, treatments, and vaccines, and all three of those really. I think the hope is that, I think there's been a real focus on vaccines and tests because, in the short term, Garrett talked about, social distancing, masks, et cetera. plus tests, you can sort of, and contact tracing, you can sort of mitigate the spread of the disease, and then, with a vaccine, hopefully start to eradicate it. But obviously there are people who are going to get sick, and the reality is we need more treatments and better treatments.
So I see that it's 2:20, and we're supposed to end, but I just want to, I think these are more comments that came through rather than questions, but I wanted to just state them for the record. And this is more along the state lines. We were talking about California, the importance of CIRM, how important they are, and how they've advanced the field. But just to note, if someone could comment, if we were live, other state initiatives, Texans voted in 2007 to create the Cancer Prevention and Research Institute of Texas and to invest $3 billion in the state's fight against cancer. And then they re-upped for another $3 billion. So that's another example, California, Texas. And then we've got a quick comment here before we close around New York. The New York State Stem Cell Science Program, NISTEM, also launched in 2007, and they've issued 24 RFAs, 372 awards, 396 million, and 2020, 50 million available. So I guess what our participants are saying, there's an opportunity for federal funding and state funding as well, and maybe some collaboration between the two. But with that, I'd like, if we could clap together, we would. We are so grateful, Garrett and Andy, for you joining us today and offering your insights from Capitol Hill. So thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Take care.